This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and today's show is recorded in front of a live audience in New York City. My guest today is the Levin Professor of History at Yale University, a world-renowned scholar of 20th century European history and one of the most prominent public intellectuals in America today. His copious body of work has been controversial as it has been critically acclaimed, and I think that's a good thing. And he's joining us tonight to discuss his latest book, New York Times bestseller for 14 weeks in a row, is that right? Yeah.
Could be.
Yeah. Entitled On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. It came out earlier this year by Tim Duggan Books. Professor Timothy Snyder, welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation to join us tonight. It is a great honor.
I'm very happy to be talking to you.
So I have to start with a sort of confession. You know, I've interviewed hundreds of writers and scholars for this podcast, and usually when I have to write the introduction to the book or the topic that we'll be discussing, it's usually very straightforward. In your case, I really spent a long time trying to describe the book to myself mainly. Because it's in part a history book, it's also a political commentary, it's also a textbook of sorts. And then I realized it's actually a citizenship manual. It's a little red book, and pardon the expression, of how to be a good citizen in a democratic world that is increasingly threatened. Do you agree? Is that a good way to describe it?
I think that's very fair. I think it's important to make a distinction between a history book proper and a book that draws from history. So one could say this is not really a history book, and that would be true, just like Black Earth is not really a civics manual. They're two different things, and I think it's very important for those of us who want to function in the public sphere to accept that there's a distinction between academic work and political activism, and that those are two different things and one ought not to confuse them. There are ways in which being a historian may prepare one for this kind of thing. The same way that if you, for example, went to medical school and became a neurologist and then 25 years later your neighbor had a heart attack, you might think, okay, I should help that person because I do remember what I learned maybe in the first 6 weeks of medical school, right? Maybe me rather than the lumberjack, right? Maybe me rather than the podiatrist should go and do something. Okay, the podiatrist would probably also be okay. But the idea is that the history gives you some kind of a background which in a moment of emergency you might want to bring to bear. And the history in my case is the history, as I'm sure many of you will know, of some of the darker chapters of European history. And in becoming that historian, that person who wrote that history, I wasn't just learning, the Polish and the Yiddish and the Russian and the German, all the things you have to learn, reading the sources, spending years with the sources. I was also becoming close to people who had lived through those experiences, some of whom were my teachers. And then in the last 10 or 15 years, as I've become a historian, who teaches students, I've had students from Eastern Europe who have grown up in a world where democracy is not arriving, but rather receding, whose entire world, since they were born circa 1989 or later, has been actually the reverse of what was promised to them. And it's from that history and those teachers and those students that I have the sense, that these things can happen, right? Because everything that happened could happen. That's one of the few sure things one can say about history. That they happen to people like us, because if they happen to my teachers who taught me and we can talk, then that's people like us. And that they're happening now, right? That's what happened in the United States is not unique or special or particularly isolated. It's part of a global trend, and we have to try to learn from others, not just in the past, but in the present. So yeah, it's a kind of civics manual, yeah.
Yeah. So when was really the turning point that you thought to yourself, okay, this book has to be written? When did the clock hit midnight?
Look, I'd stress that it's, the dramatic story of like how a book gets written. This is a really unusual book. And I kind of dislike the genre where author explains himself, because I don't think authors really know why we do things. But there are times when it's clearer than other times. And so I guess, in fairness, you're right. I mean, this is one of the few times when I actually decided to do something. Usually when you write a book, if you're a serious historian, you go off, you have some ideas, and then you do the research and you realize your initial ideas were wrong. And the people who don't realize that are not historians, right? I mean, the people who have ideas and they go out and they find the sources that support those ideas, they write books too. And sometimes those books are very popular, but those people are not actually historians. Historians are people who have hypotheses, they go out, they test them, they change their minds a whole bunch of times. This is something very different. I mean, this is me thinking, okay, we're in a situation where something ought to be done. And the virtue of already understanding some history is that it can give you a head start. So the idea of this book was that we have, not just me, I mean, it's really not about me, but people who I know, either personally or from whom I have learned as activists or scholars or dissidents or oppositionists or diarists or chroniclers, that from all of this wisdom, we can hit back fast, and that this is what we're going to have to do. So I was trying to compress 100 years into a moment, essentially, and I wrote this book very, very quickly. If it exists, so I wrote the book 6 months ago, over an extremely short period of time. If it resembles today's reality, that's because I anticipated today's reality. I wrote this before the inauguration. I wrote it within the 20 lessons were a few days after the election of Mr. Trump to be president of the United States. So the idea is that if we can grasp hold of history, sort of ironically, history, it seems slow and cobwebby and dusty and boring, but history is actually the thing which allows you to get out front. History is the thing that if you remember it fast enough, you can actually anticipate the problems, you can recognize the patterns, and you can prepare yourself to do something. If you have the history, you know what's possible, but also you know what some of the answers are. If you just wait and see, and this is lesson 1 of the book, don't obey in advance. If you just wait and see, if you just say mañana, if you just wait for your friends, if you renormalize yourself, if you allow your soul to drift along and be eroded by the new currents, then you'll end up not doing anything. So history is meant to be a way to prevent all of that.
So really the turning point, the moment of emergency was Trump's election. Do you think that this book could have been written if history turned out otherwise? I mean, was it pertinent for American society, not even 7 months ago, say 5, 10, 20 years ago?
There are certainly things in the book that pertain to the U.S. that were relevant before Mr. Trump was elected, and some of them are enablers of the election of Mr. Trump. So in the very end of the book, I make this contrast between politics of inevitability, I call it, and the politics of eternity, where the politics of inevitability is the notion, which we have on both the right and the left, that there's a certain pattern to history, things are going to turn out a certain way, and therefore our own individual responsibility is minimal, zero really. And the past doesn't matter so much because the past are just the ingredients that are going to go into the baking of this inevitable cake of the future, so you don't really have to know them. Whereas the politics of eternity is this idea that you're always at the center, history is cyclical, you're virtuous, there are enemies that come around regularly to come after you. Those ideas were already out there. So the Obama and the Clinton administrations, if we're going to name names, and the Hillary Clinton candidacy embodied some of these problems of inevitability. Like, things are basically going in the right direction, so maybe we can turn our eyes away from some of the particular problems which led people to vote, rationally or not, for Mr. Trump. Some of the other problems of American democracy are mentioned in here. So, for example, in lesson 3, where I talk about the one-party state, the gerrymandering, the money in politics, the voter suppression laws, the electoral college, the very things which helped Mr. Trump to get elected are also the non-democratic features of our current arrangements. Those problems were already there. And many of the things I talk about in this book, like the privatized armed forces or the privatized penitentiary system, those things were already there. But there is something special when you elect someone who says he doesn't care about democratic outcomes, when you elect someone whose entire life has been one long challenge to the rule of law, when you elect someone who admires only foreign tyrants, when you elect someone who so obviously just wants to be a Russian-style kleptocrat. That's his aspiration. I mean, that's his grand aspiration, right? I mean, you just look at him when he talks about other Russian kleptocrats. It's like he's talking about like the uncle, who he admired or whatever. So that was something special, right? I mean, Hillary Clinton was a much more normal figure, a normal flawed figure. This was something special. And it's important to recognize that there are just these moments in history which partly you can explain structurally, as I tried to do, but partly they're just accidental. He decided to run. He got lucky. Russian cyber capability just happened to have reached a certain point by 2016. Like, all these accidents came together, and here we have them. And you have to recognize when there are these exceptional moments. You can't just say, oh, well, this is just like, this is just normal, because it's not.
Mm-hmm. But what about I'm trying to think about really this moment of emergency, and I mean we can talk a lot about Mr. Trump's personality and all the rules that he broke. But if we're talking about really this slow decline into, I wouldn't say tyranny per se, but tyrannical aspects of government, we can look at the last decade in the aftermath of 9/11 with the restriction of civil liberties, and of course you explore at length about the notion of truth and the government lying and that nobody cares about the facts anymore. The American government blatantly lied about Iraq, about weapons of mass destruction. Do you see a link really between these two phenomena, the style of government? I mean, other than the structural aspects that you just discussed, is there really something in the spirit of government in America that has prepared us for the moment that we are in?
I mean, once things happen, we naturally fix on the parts of the past which seem linked to the present. And there are, of course, some preconditions, but other things were possible, right? I mean, just a mild twist and a turn, and Hillary Clinton is currently the President of the United States, and we would be having an entirely different conversation, even though the world was the same world. So sure, there were some potentialities and some links. I'm going to focus in on 9/11, but in a slightly different way, if you don't mind.
Sure.
9/11 is a good example of a shock which Americans failed to understand for the most part. I mean, I felt very drawn to the city where we are now because in this part of America more than other parts, I felt like people were reacting despite the immediacy of the shock and the horror in a sensible and reasonable way. But in general, one can blame the leadership, and I agree with you, but in general, we Americans let ourselves go along with the idea that in a moment of shock and fear, one possible antidote is the big lie. Right? If something terrible happens to you, then you want a story, and you want a story that makes sense, in which you somehow become the actor who's going to undo this great problem. That's the invasion of Iraq, which, as you say, has nothing whatsoever to do with the problem of the Saudi terrorists who brought down the World Trade Center here, but it has everything to do with the desire to somehow be brought into a story. So that was a good example of a big lie. We learned how vulnerable Americans are to a big lie, but when I think of 9/11 and compare it to today, what I think of is just how much worse things could be. So that leadership was very bad. I was one of the Americans who opposed that war from the beginning. It was the one period in my life when I couldn't get published. Such was the patriotic fervor that we largely were in at that time, even though the things I thought I was trying to say were pretty straightforward, like if you're trying to oppose terrorism, knocking down a secular state is probably not such a great idea. The occupation is going to take a really long time. It's going to be counterproductive. You're going to end up leading to more terrorism rather than less, et cetera. Those things seemed pretty obvious to me at the time. I don't think it's so sad we had to do this 20-year-long experiment in order to prove the obvious. But the thing that worries me now, though, is that bad as that leadership was, this leadership is qualitatively worse. So this leadership, if faced with a comparable scenario, I think would do things that leadership would not, like actually blame all Muslims, like actually call for a state of emergency in the United States, right? It's bad that Bush said, let's just go shopping. Okay, that's bad. Worse would be, let's just go shopping, and by the way, the Constitution is going to be suspended for the foreseeable future. I have no trouble whatsoever imagining that with this group, in part because of the way they talk about terrorism. They talk about terrorism in an almost loving way. They really like terrorism to be the subject of conversation. The slightest prompt anywhere in the world, and they'll move the subject to terrorism. And in particular, the fact that they admire Russian methods of combating terrorism, which are to kind of bring terrorism into the mainstream, to cooperate in the strange way that right-wing regimes and terrorists sometimes cooperate in order to build authoritarianism. That worries me a lot.
Mm-hmm. But then again, America is an illustrious democracy and has been for centuries, long before.
Don't say that. Don't say that, because don't. Please don't. Please don't. Because then you're drawing me into like the two white guy conversation, where one guy I said, America has been a democracy for 200 years, and then I have to nod and say, no, we have not been a democracy for hundreds of years. I mean, not in the modern sense of democracy, which is one person, one vote. Right? African Americans have been able to vote for about 50 years, and their right to vote is constantly under threat. Women have been able to vote for about 100. Right?
Okay, so
and
here
in the last 20 years, we've been drifting away, not towards democracy. American democracy would be a very good thing. It's an aspirational thing. I'm all for it. I think a democratic system would be a better system than the one we have now.
Okay.
It would lead to better outcomes. Okay, so I'm happy to answer your question about institutions, but I'm not happy with that we've been a democracy for centuries.
So
because we have.
Let's just say that unlike many other democracies, illustrious or not, or perfect or not, America hasn't seen a tyrannical regime since independence. I mean, the founding fathers, as you say in the book, did call Britain a tyranny, and that's really the point of departure in your whole thesis. And, looking at it 250 years on sounds a bit naive. But, I mean, many of the examples that you explore in your book, like Nazi Germany and communist Russia and others, these are periods that America has never seen. So I won't argue with you about how flawed the American democratic system is. I'm sure that you'll find that I agree with you a lot more than other people. But there is something, I don't quite know what it is. Some people have called it American exceptionalism, but that will set you off on another rant, probably.
It's already been planning, yeah.
That has kept tyranny at bay in America. What was it?
I think I'm a little freer in my judgments about this because I'm an American and I'm a historian, but I'm not an American historian. And when I look at the U.S., I'm not looking at it through the eyes of someone who spends his time reading American sources, right? I mean, there are whole decades in the 19th century where I'd really have to think about, who was president and when was the Missouri Compromise. These are things I have not thought about for a really long time. I'm looking at the U.S. from the part of the world, which is a little bit, much more like the part of the world that you come from or that your family came from, presumably. Mm-hmm. That is, I'm looking at America from the lens of what is possible for human beings in general. And when I look at Americans today, I don't start from the assumption that these are people who are particularly wise and courageous because, I love my country, and loving my country means noticing that we're not all so wise and courageous. And when I compare Americans to Russians or Poles or Ukrainians or others with whom I spend lots of time, and when I compare Americans in their 20s to people who I know who have taken real risks for democracy, it's not at all clear to me that Americans come off better. So, that's where I'm starting from. There may be other points to start from. I can't start from an American exceptionalist point of view because I'm aware that what's exceptional about America is inside me, that I'm an American. It's not coming from the outside world, right? Patriotism for me is about wanting your country to be the thing that it could be rather than saying, oh, we're exceptional. The thing about exceptionalism is, I'll try to make this a less emotional rant, but the thing about exceptionalism is that it's universal. You don't find peoples who say, we're not exceptional. Right? Try to find a nation which says, well, you know what?
You're in good company.
Yeah, right. We're just a nation like any other nation, like Israel, for example, right? That's not the motto of Israel, right? The motto of Israel is not we're a nation like any other nation. Although it should be, right? Nobody has that motto, although everyone should. It'd be a great motto. We could all share it. It should be on the doors of the United Nations. But with the exceptionalism and the founding fathers, what I'm on to, and I think maybe where you're going with this question, is to understand that the founding fathers could not have been American exceptionalists, right? We, in our cult of them, in our American cult of them, they're the images, right? They're the pantheon of our exceptionalist myth. But they themselves were terribly skeptical about human nature, and they were very doubtful that the republic they founded was going to succeed for very long because they were basically skeptical Enlightenment figures who thought that tyranny was the natural state and that our human weaknesses would lead us in that direction. So when you ask me what's special about the United States, the first thing is luck. Right, our colonization of North America was relatively easy compared to the colonization which other European powers found blew back on them in the 20th century. We didn't have colonial blowback in the 20th century in the same way, although we had our own problems. We have been, I believe, extremely lucky in our leaders. I think we were lucky with Washington. I think we were lucky with Lincoln. I think we were lucky with FDR. If you look at and now moving into more familiar territory, for Americans and Israelis alike, if you look at the United States of America in the 1930s and you compare it to Latvia or Lithuania or Poland or places which have very dark sets of references in a contemporary Jewish or Israeli imagination, the United States of America was not so different. The ways that we discussed Jewish refugees, letting alone our actual practices, but the way we talked about Jewish refugees as terrorists and communists and so on, were not so different. Other much smaller countries with much worse reputations took far more Jews than we did in the 1930s. And there's a reason for that. And that reason was American white supremacy, American provincialism, and American anti-Semitism. So I think we were lucky with FDR. And one of the things which has happened to us now is that after the financial crisis of 2008, in this general global environment of the return of authoritarianism, the far right, we're not so lucky right now. We don't have a good leader for the first time. And part of the test I think we're facing is, I mean, really, this is a put your money where your mouth is type situation. If we really were exceptional, we would be dealing with this much better than all those other people. Are we? I'm not seeing that yet. If we really care about freedom, let's show it, right? I think we've been a little bit lucky.
I want to explore that a bit in more depth, because your book is, in a sense, an appeal to the American citizen rather than the, thought leader or political leader or people with really status of power. Going back to the institutions, as you say, institutions don't defend themselves. What is it really that, the American man on the street can do to defend democracy? I mean, this is really a major part of the book. But really, what are the bare essentials that we, not we, you, as private citizens can do?
So, just a remark on the question. It's very much true that this book was addressed to American citizens. It's the first time I've ever done that. It's not just that this is a civics manual rather than a work of European history. It's that it is actually addressed to Americans, which is not how I've ever thought I was going to be writing. The irony of that is that I did the most American thing I could possibly think of doing, and nevertheless, most of the readers are not American. Right. Nevertheless, the book has been published in 30 countries around the world. Nevertheless, I get email from Malaysia and Iran and Korea and China. So nevertheless, despite the fact that I was attempting to do something for Americans in late 2016, it turns out that this problem of how your question, how do you defend a civil society, how do you defend a republic in the 21st century, it turns out that there's a gap there. It turns out that there's a demand for this. So the answer to your question, is that we are more powerful than we think we are. In a standard democratic setting, there are things that we should do. In an authoritarian regime, there are things that we can't do. We're in between that now. And in that transition, each citizen is actually much more important than he or she thinks he is. Because an authoritarian regime change, and we can talk about why I think we're in one or whether we're in one, but in an authoritarian regime change, one of the few things historians agree about is that the authoritarians need consent. They need the help of the people. They're not supervillains striding onto the stage who can immediately do everything. They need us to do things, even if those things are as simple as doing nothing, internally normalizing, looking away from your neighbor rather than greeting them, using the phrases that the regime uses rather than other phrases. The little things like that are actually really important. And for the history of the Jews, the history of Nazi Germany, this is actually one of the first lessons of 1933. When you read memoirs of Jews, one of the things that's striking is the day when the neighbor no longer says hello, or the day when the neighbor crosses the street rather than greeting you, or the day when the shop was suddenly marked, right? And how much it mattered that there was that the shop was marked as Jewish, or that there was a Star of David on the shop. How much these external things matter, and therefore how much power we have at the beginning. The answer to your question is, that's the whole book. The whole book is 20 things that pretty much all of us can do most of the time. And there are none of us who can't do any of these things. The most important thing is to recognize that you have power now, the kind of power that you're not going to have likely in a year if you don't do anything. And that the beginning of having power is to accept that you're in a historically critical moment and to decide for yourself what's important rather than drifting. If you can do that, and that's a lot harder than it sounds, then there are a whole lot of other things you can do, like defending the institutions, like practicing corporeal politics, little things like subscribing to newspapers. You don't have to look guilty now, but I know you're not all subscribing to the newspapers that you read. The only way we know anything about the current administration is through investigations, which have to be paid for by your silly little $12 a year subscription. Little things like that make a tremendous difference. Towards the end of the book, there are some of the more dramatic things. But I think the important thing is that if you can make the mental adjustment, the things that are necessary to do are actually pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm. Looking back at the historical instances of the 20th century, those that you focus, I'd say about 90% of the examples that you mentioned, Hitler and Stalin, and the derivative effects of them. One thing you can say about both of them is that as much as they were evil, and they were also very efficient, and they could very easily or quite successfully implement their evil agenda. Taking the Trump administration, someone I saw described it as House of Cards with a cast of Veep. So on the one hand, they are they could be very evil, but you can see that they're not entirely efficient as we think of Hitler and Stalin to have been. Don't you think that this is really a major difference in looking at how America is slowly sliding into tyranny?
Sure, but I actually think it's beside the point. So the point about history is not that you try to find the perfect match and then say yes or no. This is something that Americans are guilty of over and over again. And it's something that I get an awful lot with respect to this book, but also with respect to other work on the Holocaust, where people have a very clear idea of what 1933 was like. They might be right, they might be wrong. That's almost beside the point. But all they're concerned about is this exactly like 1933? And if it's not served up to us on a silver platter, which says this is exactly like February 1933, then we send it back to the kitchen, right? We say this does not interest us because it's not. So we have this idea, which is a consumerist and essentially lazy idea. I mean, we Americans, right? That if it's not exactly like that, then then we're fine, right? Then we're okay. But of course, no authoritarian regime was ever exactly like any other authoritarian regime. I mean, you'd be an idiot in Spain, in 1938 if you said, well, this isn't exactly like Mussolini, therefore Franco's going to be just fine, right? And you'd be an idiot in Czechoslovakia in 1948, although there were many such people, to say, well, this is not going to be Goldfeld as, sorry if this is obscure, but Goldfeld as head of the Czechoslovak communist regime is not going to be just like, the Hungarian communist regime, therefore it's going to be okay, right? You'd be a fool. And of course it wasn't just like it. Now, the point of the book, you're right that I lean very heavily on the examples I know, which are Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But I also include other fascist examples, and I include authoritarian examples from the 21st century as well, because the point about history is that if you have a broad enough set of cases, you can begin to recognize patterns rather than looking for perfect resemblances. And then when you see a pattern, within that pattern, there's also somebody who's told you what you can do. So, I mean, I'm happy to talk about how I think how incompetent Trump is. In certain ways, he's incompetent. But, I mean, I will issue the following. He's also very competent in certain ways. He's a good speaker. He's got a sense for his audience. He has certain kinds of intuitions that are very sound. But, I mean, I would just sort of as a footnote invite you to read the New York Times coverage of Hitler in 1932 and 1933, because pretty much there's a lot of word for word for looking for rhymes. Like the way that our press covered Hitler in 1933 was rather similar to the way our press is covering Trump. Like, it's a clown, he's incompetent, there's no coherent ideology. Again, I'm not saying that means that they're exactly the same. I'm just saying that we ought to be on our guard against the various stories about how this will get taken care of by itself.
No, but the question is not whether they are exactly the same, but are we exactly the same?
Yeah.
I mean, you can give the New York Times in 1933 the benefit of the doubt of not knowing what modern authoritarianism is, but now we do. And there is a significant backlash from democratic forces, and certainly inside America, but also around the world. Is this not something that you think might really outweigh the very ominous signs that we see around us?
So, I'm in activist mode in this conversation. Let's have a conversation in 70 years when you and I will both still be flourishing, no doubt. Probably you a little bit more than I. And then we can talk about the history, like when we've read the sources, and then we can talk about what outweighs what. I would say we're still, I'll try to answer your question, but for me it's very important that we're still in a moment where the history is open. And so the question of what outweighs what is still less important than what we actually do. And when you speak of these forces they're not forces, right? They're human beings, and a lot of these human beings are making judgments based precisely on how they understand history. So when Americans during the first Muslim ban got out and protested in the airports, that's because a lot of them were smart enough to see that the Muslim ban wasn't about Muslims but about them, that it was about changing political discourse and the way politics functioned, and they made that connection quickly enough because they were thinking about the 1930s. And we can say, well, that it's not exactly the same, and it's not. But if we don't think, if we're not active, if we don't use history, these forces stop existing. That's my basic point. So if we want to go to comparing our character with the character of Germans in the 1930s, for me that's not such a great comparison, because for one thing they had attention spans. For another thing they had more reporters than we do. I mean, admittedly those people were soon in jail or had to emigrate. The state of science was, you might have noticed, was pretty great in the early 1930s Germany, and before Hitler came to power. It was generally celebrated German science. We're maybe not doing so well on that score. right? United States. So when this comparison of us and them, I'm also very skeptical about how we're more virtuous than Europeans in the past. If we compare us, I mean, to Czechoslovaks in 1948, which is, I just mentioned it because it's one of the examples in the book, it's just not clear to me that we are better read or that we're even better Democrats than Czechoslovaks in 1948. So yeah, I mean, the way that I agree with you is the way that I begin with the book, which is that we potentially have the advantage that we can learn from those people. Right, we can learn from what Milan Kundera said about 1948 in Czechoslovakia, or from what Václav Havel said about Czechoslovakia in the 1970s. We can learn from Klemper's diaries about 1930s and how important language was and how important the face of the world was. We can learn from Hannah Arendt. We can learn from them. But we have to make the effort to do that, and there's a basic issue of responsibility here which hangs together with our historical moment. We chose, many of us, right, not you personally, we chose, not me personally either, so let's say they. No. That's the thing you're not supposed to do, by the way. You're not supposed to make that we-they distinction. So in the West, it was very common after 1989 to say some version of history is over. And the consequence of that belief is that you can say, we were right, they were wrong, our capitalist whatever system was right, their communist whatever system was wrong, and therefore history doesn't matter anymore. And the engagement that a lot of Americans had, which was serious with European and with Russian culture and language and so on, faded away. Our knowledge of the great mid-century thinkers, critics of totalitarianism, for example, that knowledge dissipated, and fast. And that made us very vulnerable. So we chose to say that history was over, and now we have to, I think, to choose to say, let's humbly learn from history. Let's humbly learn from people who left things behind for us.
Looking back still on history, of course there are all the ominous and negative examples, but if you look back on the 20th century, there are many instances that you can learn from. I'm thinking specifically of the anti-Dreyfusards in the very early years of the 20th century that defeated evil in this sense, or these authoritarian and negative effects. The mobilization of the Spanish Republicans that was sizable yet not that successful, and going back to this country, McCarthyism that eventually failed thanks to quite a lot of virtuous Americans. I'm trying to think what was really the thinking, if I'm sure that there was some thinking behind running this negative campaign of saying, look at the dark episodes of history, don't go there, rather than look at the more positive aspects of history where nations were faced with these challenges and learn from them.
Mm-hmm. So one of the premises of the book is that if we're going to be decent defenders of a democratic order or of a civil society, we have to do the thing that we know how to do. So civil society isn't about everybody doing everything. It's about people making stands on the areas where they're comfortable intellectually, morally, politically. There could be versions of this book which were written from the perspective of someone in the American civil rights movement. There could be versions of this book which came from South Africa in the 80s. There could be versions of this book that came from Latin America as well. This is what I could do. In the short time that was given to me, what I could do is I could take the 25 years I've spent learning these languages and these histories and try to put it to use in this way. So that's why I don't, for example, write about the American Civil Rights Movement, as important as it is, as crucial as it is as an example for Americans, because that's not where I'm comfortable. That's not what I think I understand. What I think I understand is why Adam Michnik wrote as he did, or Václav Havel wrote as he did, or Victor Klemper wrote as he did. I'm trying to draw from the people who I think I understand and trying to make them comprehensible. Now, the second thing would be, I'm trying to do both things with history at the same time. History in this book is meant to be bracing in two different ways. It's meant to be bracing in the sense that it spreads before us, and this is less relevant for Israelis maybe than for Americans, but it spreads before us the possibilities of what can happen. Right, that the it that can happen here has many different faces and many different possibilities. It's just not true that one has to have some version of liberal democracy. There are plenty of other things on the bandwidth of political possibility, and the book is a reminder of what those things are and how close they are to us. But the history is also meant to be bracing in a separate sense, which is that I am actually citing over and over again instructions from people who were successful or who weren't successful but who were right about the nature of authoritarian regimes. So it's meant to be bracing also in the sense that you would brace yourself against a wall. It's meant to give you strength. So I think in order to know where you are, you have to look into the dark. But in the dark, there are precisely these exemplary lights, and those are the people that I end up citing the most in the book. The people, like Ionesco writing about fascist Romania, the people who saw something about what was happening and generously left it for us.
Mm-hmm. But ultimately, they failed, and I think that that's really the very pessimistic bottom line of the message.
No, it's not. I mean, I have to completely disagree with that. It's not a. If I thought ultimately they failed was the bottom line of the book, right? I would not be talking to you here today. I would not have written the book. I did not write the book to tell Americans ultimately the lesson of the 20th century is they failed, right? That's not. I mean, it's not. That's not helpful. I would put this in a slightly different way. For one thing, a lot of these people succeeded, right? So solidarity succeeded. One of the examples that appears over and over is solidarity. There are other examples of civil resistance which have succeeded recently as well, and we ought to be aware of those. But the point is that we can do the things that they can't if we learn from them. So Klemperer didn't have a Klemperer to read. Havel didn't have a Havel to read. Arendt didn't have an Arendt to read, right? You can say, Ionesco didn't have a Ionesco to read. So you can say Ionesco and Arendt went to immigration. Havel was powerless in his time. All true, but the advantage we have is that we can learn from them, and therefore we can head off the things that have yet to happen to us. That's the purpose of the book. That this ought not to have all been in vain. If the 20th century was the way it was, let us learn from it, and let us learn most quickly from the people who said the most intelligent things. And I just can't help but focus on this, and generously left it behind for us. Because Klemperer, was not really writing for himself. You know who I'm talking about. Victor Klemperer, the great literary critic, German Jewish, kept this diary. He was a very good student of Nazi language. He was alive because his wife was German and she didn't divorce him. He wasn't writing for himself. He was writing because he thought other people might face similar predicaments, and I'm going to help them recognize. Even Hannah Arendt, she wasn't writing for herself really, or her friends. I mean, she was writing Origins of Totalitarianism because she thought totalitarianism had something to do with the modern soul, which we still have, and that other people will be vulnerable to it. So, there's a generosity there. And for me, I find it painful when we don't reach back to that, because that text was written forward. It was written to reach us. And in the book, I'm trying to play a really humble mediating role in trying to remind us of all of this, right? So, yeah, I don't like pessimism and optimism because I think history is open, but it's dark to remind us where we have to look for the light. That's the point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you did say earlier that you're a historian of this specific period, but I would like, nonetheless, to push you a bit forward on one thing that you discussed briefly in the book. I think it's chapter 17 or 18, about other countries around the world that are experiencing a similar trend, this decline of democratic traditions. Maybe the analogy, the comparison to places like Turkey or Hungary or India. Russia is a slightly a different example because we can't really speak of a decades-long democratic tradition there. But Turkey and Hungary and India, and to a certain extent Israel as well, have had long-standing democratic traditions that have been eroding and have been under attack by authoritarian or aspiring to be leaders. And also, you spent a long time in Eastern Europe, currently teaching there, researching there. You do speak a number of East European languages. You do interact with people there. So my question is perhaps twofold. What are really the things that you learned from them, being an American in foreign land? And why did it not feature more prominently in the book?
So, with the I really like the framing of the question as international, and in the book I did as much with that as I could. I think it's quite right, and I wish somebody else would do it, to write a book about just how India, Hungary, Turkey are like are not like the contemporary United States. That was out of my reach. I could say a little bit about contemporary Russia and Ukraine because I'd been following the press and I'd spent time in those places and I knew people and had some basic orientation. Now, why is there not more of that in the book? I needed to start with what I thought could become again familiar reference points. So what's happened in the United States is that the 1930s, whether we're talking about the Soviet regime, we haven't been, but whether we're talking about the Soviet regime or the Nazi regime, these are historical moments that were once familiar, have now been slightly reduced to abstractions and cliches, but which I thought might be made familiar again, that they were close enough that I could reach for it and maybe get it. So those examples are there because I'm comfortable with them, but also because I thought we weren't so far away from them that it would require tremendous effort to bring them back. I take the point of your question, but there is a fair amount here which I have learned from contemporaries. So the lesson about corporeal politics, the reason why it's called corporeal politics is that a young East European friend of mine uses that specific phrase, which I'm using to try to stress the importance of getting your body out from in front of the computer screen and out into the public space and how that changes you psychologically as well as politically. The whole notion of civil society, which runs through the book, is intellectually a creation of the thinkers of the 1970s in Eastern Europe, but it's also something which is very current among people who are in their 20s and 30s and even younger. The techniques of mass mobilization, those are also things which I have seen with my own eyes in the contemporary world. And in particular, the obsession or the basic concern in the book with truth, the naive concern, what you can see as the naive concern for truth, because a lot of the things that one has to do, I think, to defend a democracy require one to look a little bit naive. Like you have to say things which sound naive, like, I think democracy is better than authoritarianism, or I think truth is better than lies. Right? That's an easy one. That's an easy one for people to laugh at you about. Like, oh, well, what's truth anyway? I once, I had a seminar and my professor told me there really wasn't truth anymore. It's really like if you say truth is important, that can seem really naive. Just like every form of being free seems a little bit naive because every form of being free requires you to stand out a little bit from other people and opens you up to being criticized. But the truth business, of course it comes from fascism and communism. Of course it's true that in fascism, one did away with the everyday experiences in the name of a myth of unity. Of course it's true that in communism, one did away with the everyday experiences in the name of some utopia that was to come. But the truth business is actually the most central to precisely the postmodern authoritarianism, of which Russia is the best example, although other people are imitating Russia, including the leader of the United States of America. And that is the idea that you fill up the public sphere quite consciously with lies and contradictions. And then that's step one. And then you say, well, it's not me, it's the journalists who generate the fake news. And you go after them just as hard as you can. And then, you hope that your success is that in the end, nobody really believes in truth. And the trick is the people who say they don't believe in truth, like they don't know who to believe, they think they're smart. They think they're cynical. They think they're modern. They think they're on top. They think they're skeptical. They think they're like rebels, right? Whereas in fact, if you rebel against truth, you are a conservative. You are a reactionary. You're accepting the way things are because without some sense of factuality, you can't agree with anyone else about what you can do, right? Reaction becomes impossible. That's how the Russian regime works. So that's pretty important to this book because I think it catches Trump in the middle of what is really a global trend, as you suggest. But it's also something that if you've looked at Russia for the last 5 years, I would cite Peter Pomerantsev's excellent book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible on this. Or if you look at the nature of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the alternate reality was tried out as foreign policy for the first time. If those things were your daily life, then what happens in the United States just seems like an example of that trend.
Mm-hmm. But then you're appealing to people who aren't necessarily thinking people to be thinking people. In a way, it can be interpreted as an effort to preach to the converted. People here in this room, in this city, probably subscribe to these ideas wholeheartedly. But the people who should be approached aren't necessarily here, and they may have a different idea of what truth is. They don't necessarily think that everything that's written in the New York Times is truth. There's also in the book, there's a few instances of ambivalent language. For example, support a good cause. What makes a good cause? How do you address this open-endedness of some of the lessons, that the normative aspect of them, at the end of the day, in many cases, is in the eyes of the beholder?
So now, Gilad, I feel like this is a bit of a trap that you've organized this event in Lower Manhattan, right? Because we could have had it in Lawrence, Kansas.
Yeah.
It was your idea to have it in Manhattan, and so that
That's
you can set this up with the people like us. And I would just say we don't know what these people think until they ask us questions.
Which will be soon,
right? But the book it starts from the neutral assumption that people aren't going to share the ideas. That for many people, this book is a kind of action plan. And I think you're quite right that many people who might broadly share some features of my view of the world could accept the premises and then move on to the action plan, which many people have in fact done. I mean, the core constituency, at least thus far, are people who had the idea that something dreadfully wrong happened in November 2016 and who were looking for something to do, which is what the book does. The book is 20 lessons, each of which comes with some form of action. And I think that's what makes it attractive precisely, that people who have a certain cast of mind can then do something. And I'm talking to those people all the time, and I have to say, I don't think that's trivial, because I don't care whether people agree with me on my worldview. I care whether people actually get out and do something, because it makes a tremendous difference right now, and that's the point of the book, right? So, which is the second part of my answer. I mean, as I say, you're the one who's got me trapped in Hebrew Union in Lower Manhattan, right? I was in Ohio right before this, right? I was in Ohio for a week right before this, and I'm not just trying to preach to the converted. I mean, I'm trying to make the converted into activists, but the book is meant to support a certain kind of constitutional arrangement, which is why it starts with the Founding Fathers, which I do slightly naively, but with perfectly sincere conviction. It's why it pays so much attention to precisely constitutional and Republican, small r Republican traditions, because I'm also after people who are going to agree with parts of it, but not all of it. And there are a lot of such people. I mean, I'm now in dialogue with a lot of Republicans, including Republican elected officials, not all of whom, some of whom tell me not to mention their names, right? So I won't. But I am in dialogue with a lot of people who are not by any stretch of the imagination on the left, or would not typically be in the place where you and I happen to be now, and that's a very important part of the book.
Okay, so we've kind of reached the stage of opening the floor to you, the audience here in the room. If anyone has got a question, now is the time. Please.
Thank you. I have a philosophical question about teaching, which is relevant to this topic. I'm a high school history teacher, and I'm also the father of high school-age kids in high school. And
God bless you.
Thank you. I kind of have a little guideline or slogan that I go by as a teacher, but it's also an expectation I have for my kids in school, which is that politics has no place in the classroom. And I wonder if you could react to that. And the context is that regardless of my political views, I think there's a big sort of power and information imbalance between teacher and student. Obviously, there should be. As a voter, I certainly don't want teachers sort of pushing their views on my kids, even if they happen to be in agreement. And I sort of respect the same courtesy, so to speak, and also see a lot of problems with just sort of pushing views down on my students. So my question is if you could react to that, especially in the context of what many people would agree is some kind of crisis mode right now, vis-a-vis the things you've been describing.
Yeah. No, that's a wonderful question, and as I'm sure you would expect, it's something that I give a lot of thought to, right? So the first thing that I wanted to say about it has to do with the two vocations that I mentioned earlier. So I regard this as two different vocations. So I'm not going to go back and rewrite anything that I said in Black Earth or Bloodlands or any of my other books because of what happened in 2017. Nor did I change a word of my lecture class in East European history. I think some of my students may have found some of the themes more enlivening and pertinent than in past years, but I didn't change a thing, nor would I change a thing. And when my students asked me to speak about after November, right, they came to me and they said, will you talk about this? because, like a lot of other Americans, I think they were trying to process what had happened. And as you suggest in your question, there's no point imagining nothing happened just because one has a certain professional responsibility. I said, I will speak to you about it if you will organize at a non-class time and in a non-class place a forum for it. I'm not going to organize it. I'm not going to talk about it in class time. But if you organize something yourselves from your own organizations, which they did, then I will come and talk about it. And some of the ideas in the epilogue come from that conversation that I had with them. I think it is really important to maintain the distinction between the two vocations. I absolutely agree. But there is a kind of fallback, which is that one can't make everything totally neutral. So being a physician or being a lawyer or being a university professor does have a background of politics to it. So for example, I teach at a private university, which suggests that I think private universities are acceptable. I teach at a private university where women are admitted, which suggests that I think that that's acceptable. I teach at a liberal arts university, which suggests that I have a certain idea about the humanities. All those things are true, and all those things are potentially under attack, right? And I will defend all of those things as can be. So yes, the way I handle it is that they're the two vocations. And no, I would not want anyone who's thinking of sending their kids to Yale to be thinking that I'm going to be saying the same things in the classroom that I say here. That's really important. That said, there are some things that are political, which we might take for granted and see as not being political, which I think universities or schools have to defend. Like the very idea that there's mandatory public education, the very idea that there are public schools at all, right? That's political. That's contested. And I'm on one side of that.
Yes, Lisa, please.
I was wondering if you'd noticed any deviations from your predictions since the election, or not. That sounds a bit hubristic, but I meant, were you surprised by any of the things that happened? And the reason I'm asking that, as a moderator, I like to ask questions before I give the background. The reason I'm asking that is because the political analysis that we've seen in the mainstream, in the popular media, has been horrific, like generally just very subpar. And I think because a lot of that is because the analysts just really don't know how to handle this situation. And so you'll see like perfectly solid, well-regarded political analysts in major newspapers and magazines saying the president just acted presidential after he bombed Syria, for example. Or they'll say things like, well, our institutions are working. The circuit court successfully slapped down Trump's attempt to impose an immigration ban, and so forth. So I'm wondering, first of all, did you see anything happen that you didn't expect to happen, or any deviations from what you thought? And also, do you think that there's any reason to think that the institutions are more solid than we believed?
Okay. That's a really wonderful question. Let me start with a minor remark about predictions and then try to say something which I think is significant about what the purposes of the book. So with predictions, one thing which is interesting about predictions is that you get no credit for correct predictions in the public sphere. So I predicted, for example, that Russia would invade Ukraine. I was pretty much the only one who did so. I was much mocked for it at the time. And then when Russia did invade Ukraine, I predicted a few weeks ahead of time and said it's going to happen in a few weeks. Exactly one person wrote to me and said, you were right. Because the nature of making predictions is that if you make a correct prediction, nobody who was around who didn't make that correct prediction is ever going to forgive you, right? And so therefore you don't, whereas if you make an incorrect prediction, you pay no price for that. So one of the features of one of the features of the let's say mediocre media coverage of these events is that people make incorrect predictions all the time and they pay no price. One of them being that, for example, after he's elected, he's going to change. Right? That turns out not to be true, but nobody remembers who makes those incorrect predictions. I mean, making incorrect predictions is part of the job description, I think, of being in the commentariat. And it's kind of there's a sort of culture that everyone's going to forgive everyone else's incorrect predictions. So predictions are tough. I've made a couple of correct predictions, and I'm kind of proud of those correct predictions. Like I predicted that the war in Ukraine was going to be primarily about the West, and that the tactics that we saw, the fake news, for example, in Ukraine, were going to come to us. That turned out to be true, right? But nobody remembers, those kinds of things. So I'm proud of those things, and I'm proud of the fact that this book, although it was written from what my philosopher colleagues would call first principles, right? Rather than from some kind of fine-tuned understanding of American politics or the biography of Donald Trump, that a lot of the patterns that I try to warn us against, those are actually present in the world. I wish they weren't, but they are. Now, the reason I like your question so much is that the book is an attempt to help people to think outside of the categories they're getting from the media. So aside and apart from the question of who's making correct and incorrect predictions, and whether, even aside from the question of how well daily media describes reality, where do we get concepts? Because the media starves us of concepts. And in moments where everything is up for grabs, what you need are concepts so you can ask, where can it go and what can I do to stop it? You need the concepts. So the book, part of the book is at the same meta level that your question is. The book, some of the lessons of the book are things like limit your time in front of the screen, right? Use this, not this sort of media. Keep your digital equipment away from your bed, like stuff at that level, so you can shield yourself from the babada of the news cycle and think about what's going on. Because going back to something Gilad said, thinking has to be popular, right? I mean, thinking's a choice. We don't have to be great at it, but a little bit of it goes a long way, frankly. And not thinking is also a choice. Staring at the screen is a choice, and not staring at the screen is also a choice. So one of the things the book is meant to do is and one of the reasons that history is there and this dark history is there is because the people who reflect on the dark history gave us some of the concepts that we can apply. We don't have to agree about how much they apply, right? I'm happy to disagree with people about just how much fascism there is in the White House, but fascism is a very useful concept. It's a helpful concept. So that's what I think. Oh, sorry, on what's gone better. I mean, basically, it looks about what I thought it would look like. Like it's Ukrainian-style kleptocracy with just enough fascism, like to make it work. That's what I thought it would look like, and that's what. So in terms of how people have reacted, the lawyers have been better than I thought, in general, right? Because my model of lawyers is Germany in the 1930s, right? So I have a low standard. With some exceptions, like the fact that the Attorney General perjured himself in his confirmation hearings is not such a great example. But the lawyers have generally been better. A lot of Americans have been faster than I thought, like the airport protests. But one thing that surprised me in the other direction is the Republican Party. The Republican Party, I mean, its elected representatives have been much more normalizing than I expected in a much more uniform way. And the idea that Russians are better than Democrats is much more widespread than I would have thought it was going to be. So.
Just one quick follow-up. Do you think that there's any evidence to support this contention that the institutions are more robust than we thought?
No. So what are the institutions we're relying on, right? The legislative branch is maybe now slowly starting to do something, but our legislature is Article 1 of the Constitution. That's supposed to be the most important branch of government, and one cannot say that it's been behaving like that, right? Americans, when they talk about checks and balances, what they really meant was the Republicans have the Congress and the Democrats have the White House, or vice versa. When the same party holds both, you just don't see checks and balances happening the same way. I mean, it's so obvious that it almost hurts me to say it, but I will say it anyway. Were the present inhabitant of the White House a Democrat, impeachment would have been on day one. Because he's obviously violating the Emoluments Clause, right? And even without the Russia thing, they would have probably impeached on day one. I mean, if you compare, and I'm about to break your brains, if you compare Monica Lewinsky, right, to this, I mean, the main institution is supposed to be Congress. Congress has let us down as a body, and the courts less so, right? But some of the institutions we're talking about are things which are I'm in favor of their doing their jobs. Don't get me wrong, but there is something wrong when we're counting on the spies to protect us from the generals, and the generals to protect us from the kleptocrats, and the kleptocrats to protect us from the fascists. And that's basically what we're doing. And those aren't standard issue institutions, right? I mean, there is no article in the Constitution about the kleptocrats and their role and the fascists and their role and the FBI and its role. That's kind of what we're counting on, right? I mean, we're counting on Mueller. That's not exactly checks and balances, right? It is the rule of law, but it's really a kind of last resort. So, I mean, With the institutions, my basic idea is that there's some, going back to the very beginning of Gilad's questions, there are some flaws with the institutions now. The gerrymandering makes the Congress what it ought not to be. But if the institutions are going to work, it's going to be because we're breathing life into them. We have to do things all the time to support these institutions if we want them to do their job.
Another institution to support is the Tel Aviv Review, of course, and also listening to it is a choice and a good one. Any other questions?
My question is as much for Gilad as it is for Professor Snyder, which would be, what would each of you say are the implications of Professor Snyder's book to contemporary Israeli society?
I'd say that's obviously more a question for Gilad than it is for me.
I'd be happy to answer it after the recording's over. Yeah, I'm not used to answering questions, only asking them. I think if you really want my honest answer, while reading this book, I kept thinking that these alarm bells have been ringing in Israel for a long time, for about 20 years now, I think, since, especially since Netanyahu first came to power in Israel. And one thing that I can say about Israel is that without the quote-unquote illustrious democratic tradition of the United States, without the checks and balances, without even the separation between church and state, and other great institutions that do exist here. And also, we do have to protect them, but just by virtue of existing, they're putting America at a better position than Israel. So despite all that, Israeli democracy, with all its flaws, has proved much more resilient than many people, including myself, have thought. Now, that is not to say, of course, that things could go to hell tomorrow morning, and it certainly seems like this is the direction. But I personally would be a lot more careful about adopting what I see really is a very bleak perspective coming from the book. Another thing that I would say that I want to phrase as a question, but I would not just say what I think, is that being Israeli, going back to the so-called lessons of the Holocaust, is something that has been done to death in Israel, and for not always for very genuine reasons. I can think of Abba Eban saying that withdrawing from the West Bank would take Israel back to the Auschwitz borders, and Menachem Begin justifying the invasion of Lebanon in 1982, saying that the alternative would be a Treblinka, and of course going to Mr. Holocaust, Netanyahu said, when was it, a few years ago, on a number of occasions, but he actually said it, I think, to a Jewish group in Los Angeles, saying, this is 1938 and Iran is Nazi Germany. So my feeling is that it has been really abused and misused to the point that it's really hard to take these examples as seriously as we should.
So, okay, now that Gilad's generously given me a chance to think about this, let me give you a couple of thoughts. They're all going to be about the Holocaust. So the first has to do with where Gilad left off, what the lessons of the Holocaust are. And for me, the political lessons that are relevant for whether it's Israel or whether it's India or whether it's Malaysia or whether it's the United States, whether it's China, come from the beginning rather than the end. So in my scholarly work, I'm much less concerned about 1933 than I am about 1941. But the main preoccupation in Bloodlands and Black Earth is how precisely you get to a moment where mass killing is possible. And therefore, I tend to adopt a much more international and political theoretical perspective, which concerns how Germans and others behave in specific situations beyond the borders of pre-war Germany. That moment is not so relevant for now. I mean, we could get to something like that, I don't doubt it, but we're not anywhere near that. What's more relevant is 1933. And this gets clouded because in 1933, people didn't know there was going to be a Holocaust. Most Jews reacted to 1933, in Germany, I mean, in what we might well see as a normalizing way. That, perhaps he won, but he's not going to be in power for long, or He can't possibly do the things that he said he was going to do. That was just to win elections. He's not going to do that now, right? It's that 1933 moment which is more relevant to us now. And I might be in partial agreement with Gilad here. When you put the word Holocaust on it, then that can complicate things, because people can then very easily say, well, we're not there, and of course we're not. But one of the preconditions for getting there is a regime change of a 1933 style, and the very best work done by mostly German now, contemporary scholars on the Holocaust, like Peter Longerich, for example, is precisely about the micro-politics of 1933. And it's those kinds of lessons which I'm trying to emphasize in the book. So I'm trying not to toss around the idea of Holocaust here and there and bang people with it, but rather to say, look, you, my reader, have some idea of where it went in Nazi Germany. So let's think now about the beginning parts, which are more relevant. So that's the first thing I want to say about the Holocaust. Second thing is, yeah, I mean, I'm perfectly aware of how the politics of the Holocaust gets misused in Israel and in all kinds of other places from almost every possible angle. And much of my own public discussion has been concerned about how it can be historically useful rather than historically counterproductive. But I have to say, and this goes a little bit back to your question about things I expected or didn't expect, I didn't expect I would see so quickly a moment where I would have to insist in a very basic way that the Holocaust is actually relevant, which is a bit where we are in the United States. I mean, when we have the Attorney General talking about Hawaii as an island in the Pacific, right? That's why America went into the Second World War. Those references are not innocent. When we have a spokesman of the White House, Mr. Spicer, saying that Hitler didn't kill his own people, hence the German Jews and the German handicapped were not Germans, right? That's not innocent. When we commemorate the Holocaust in January, a few days after Mr. Trump comes to office, and when we specifically leave out the Jews, it wasn't an accident. They deliberately left out the Jews. This is something which concerns me. And it does link back to Israel, because I do think Israeli politicians should be aware, are aware, that's a naive way of putting it, but perhaps should contemplate the way that the far right, not just in the US but elsewhere, uses the physical presence of Jews and Jewish leaders in photographs and in meetings to legitimate a political stance, which essentially says, I cannot possibly be a racist anti-Semite because look, here I am with some Jews. And this is quite consciously done. I mean, it's been done for years by the European far right, and now the American far right is doing it. And that's something I think for Israeli politicians to think about, or for Israeli voters to think about.
Right. There was another question. Yes, please.
I'm going to be an irritant.
My favorite kind of questions.
I'm sorry?
That's my favorite kind of question.
Okay. Because I feel that I've landed in a bubble between the audience and the speaker. I've trained myself, when I read history and when I read economics, to always investigate what isn't there, because very often it's more important than what is. You have jumped from Bush to Trump. You have said nothing about the intervening 8 years. What do you think, for example, you talked about investigations by the newspapers, whatever. What do you think about the non-investigations for 8 years about the IRS targeting conservative groups specifically and explicitly? What do you think of the non-investigation, as an example, of the Clinton Foundation? I could go on forever, but I won't. I'd just like to get your reaction.
That's not irritating. It's perfectly reasonable. But the Clinton Foundation has actually been investigated over and over and over again. It's a legally set up foundation. The investigations of it, journalistic and otherwise, are bountiful. The idea that it hasn't been investigated is a myth. And one can make qualitative distinctions, right? The Trump Foundation, on the other hand, right, has also been investigated. And what people find when they investigate it is something else, right? That it doesn't actually use the money for charitable purposes. I think distinctions like that are useful. Your point about history is extremely well taken. It's very important when one reads history books to watch in the narrative for what is left out. It's up there in terms of his criticism of historical work. That principle which you enunciate is up there with watching out for where people begin and where they end. These things, framing things, are extremely, extremely important. I tried in my answer to Gilad's question earlier, and I can expound on it further, to be clear about how I'm critical about the Clinton and the Obama years. For me, it largely has to do with a kind of complacency about history and a kind of overweening faith in trends such as democracy and so on. But the point of the book is not a partisan one in that way. I mean, it's partisan. I meant it to be partisan for American citizens. It turns out I failed in that. It's not meant to be partisan for the Clintons or the Obamas. It's also not meant to be partisan against Mr. Trump, who, for very good reasons, I don't actually mention in the book. It's meant to be a way to help American citizens be better American citizens. And that's one of the reasons why at least some Republicans are interested in, like, I had a Republican actually ask me if he could use the 20 lessons as his platform, and I said, yes, you can. But and so I'm aiming. This goes back to one of Gilad's questions too. I'm aiming for a certain kind of citizenship, and it is my firm belief that the issues here are deeper than partisan. It's also my firm belief that when we come out the other end of this, that neither the Republican nor the Democratic Party is going to look like it did in 2016.
Right. There were a few more questions. One there.
So I'm wondering if, briefly, you could lay out what you think is the worst case scenario.
Yeah, I mean, if one accepts Gilad's portrait of me in the book, that would be my wheelhouse, right? So I will say something about that, but I mean, I want to first repeat something which I think is really important. The 20 lessons were used by the Connecticut organizers of the Women's March. This book is being used by conservative and left-wing civil society organizations to organize and mobilize members. It's a tool for action to prevent things which I think are plausible. So it's not meant to be an incomprehensible Cassandra song, right? It's not meant to just say they are disasters and they're out of our reach or something. On the contrary, it's saying, on the one hand, these disasters are possible because they happened. On the other hand, we have learned from this, and let us now remember what we have learned. That's how the book functions. I'm not going to get all the way down to worst case scenarios, because I think the worst case scenarios are a few steps and a few years away from us. But I will mention what I'm worried about in the next 18 months. The thing that I'm worried about in the next 18 months, and this goes back to the 9/11 question, is a terrorist attack on the territory of the United States, with perhaps with uncertain provenance. That's the thing I'm worried about, and the reason that I'm worried about it is that that is part of the playbook of modern tyrants since the Reichstag fire. Again, this goes back to your question about the Holocaust, sir. It's not 1942 so much as 1933, like the events that allow the regime change. Ever since March of 1933, every self-respecting modern tyrant has known that terrorism is in the mix, that you have a real, you have a provoked, or you have an imagined, a foreseen, anticipated terrorist attack, and you work that into the story, which is true for, if you're Assad, you talk about the resistance as terrorists. If you're Erdogan, you talk about civil society as terrorists. If you are Putin, you stage some terrorist attacks in order to consolidate power. It's pretty much universally understood, and I would be stunned, going back to what I expect, if Mr. Bannon didn't dream about this every night. Because it's just right in the middle of the way he sees the world, with its repeated disasters and its patterns, and with his longing for the 1930s. So that's what it's not the worst case scenario, but I think it's the important next step, and it's not. It comes also from a certain political calculus about the U.S., which is this: we're at a weird state in the history of our democracy, which is that the smaller of the two parties, the party that has fewer voters and got significantly fewer votes in the last elections, controls all the important levers of power at the federal level, and I think it's 31 of the 50 state houses. That's not healthy. It's not healthy for the country, but it's also not healthy for people in power, especially when the way you come to power is with the non-democratic part of the Constitution. So without the Electoral College, Mr. Trump loses. Without the gerrymandering, the Republicans don't have the majority in the House that they have. And so you owe where you are to the non-democratic parts of the system. And then to make matters worse, the Republicans don't have popular policy proposals. I wish they did, honestly. Like, I wish they ran for office with some good ideas and could now put them forward. I think that would be healthy and good. And then they could run in 2018 and say, we gave more people health insurance, or we built these roads, or we, here comes real fantasy. We reoriented the military to deal with the real cyber threats, which actually affect our security, right? Things like all kinds of wonderful things they could do. But instead, in 2018, unless I greatly miss my guess, they're going to have to run on stuff which is not popular. The tax cuts for the wealthy are not popular among their own electorate. The taking the health insurance away is actually not popular, even among their own electorate. So that, because they came to power on the non-democratic parts of the system, and because they don't have the kinds of things that usually run on, that temptation to maybe say, oh, well, the president is going to declare a state of emergency because of this terrorist attack in the summer of 2018, maybe that would be okay because it looks like I'm going to get creamed in my district, or maybe that would be okay because I don't really have much to campaign on, right? I worry that we might be sleepwalking a little bit towards that on the congressional side, whereas on the executive side, I'm sure those wheels are already turning. So I'm worried about the Reichstag fire type scenario, and the reason I'm talking about it is because I think the way to make it not happen is for us to think about it in advance. Because if we think about how we're going to react to it, then it loses a lot of its potency.
All right, we have time for one last question. Yes, please.
Thank you. My question is in response to your last answer. In France and in the UK, we just experienced terrorism and then elections, and I think surprising, and it's kind of counter to what your I guess fear is. So how do you think about what just happened there?
In this presidential administration, terrorism is being presented to us rhetorically as the issue of all issues. And that, I think, is a rather striking difference between us, for example, and the British. I'm not sure, you probably didn't see Trevor Noah the evening where he compared the British reaction to the cyber attacks of a few weeks ago to the American reaction, where the ransomware actually did affect Britain and didn't affect us much, but their reaction was completely calm and ours was hysterical, and he juxtaposed. There's something going on there. I mean, we are at less risk of terrorist attacks than Britain and France and obviously Israel, and yet we spend a lot more of our time talking about terrorism. Terrorism fills up a lot more of our rhetorical space than it does in Britain or France. I don't want to risk the comparison to Israel, but I suspect to Israel as well. And that itself creates a different kind of narrative expectation, because it's like everyone is waiting for it in some way. And also, we are doing something which is unusual, which is that we're courting it. I mean, one of the purposes of the Muslim bans is, I'm afraid, is to make it more likely, and also to frame the perpetrator at the moment when you don't know who the perpetrator is. And this goes back to something I said earlier, but the admiration for the way authoritarian regimes handle terrorism. You don't hear the French and the British leadership say that, right? Only our leadership says authoritarians are the ones doing a good job with terrorism. And the way authoritarians manage terrorism is that they want, it's like Goldilocks, right? They want just enough, not too much, not none, right? Not too much, but just enough to keep them in power and to change the regime. So I think unfortunately, we're in a different situation than Britain and France because of the way our leadership handles the issue. But that said, I do think I don't think it's going to work. I think it's quite possible that it would happen, but I think also Americans, this goes back to your question, one of the things which I like about Americans is that they can go from not knowing and not caring to knowing and acting really fast, right? And I think with the Reichstag fire, like that meme of a Reichstag fire type event, it's not just me. I mean, there are a number of people from different positions, from Silicon Valley to Washington, are trying to get that awareness out so that we react better than our leaders might think we're going to react. And I honestly think we will. And in the armed forces and in other important American institutions, this scenario has been thought through over and over and over again by now. So I don't actually think it will work, but I think the potential for some effort in that direction is unfortunately greater here than in France and the UK.
All right. So this is it. Professor Timothy Snyder, a Levin Professor of History at Yale University and the author of several books, including most recently On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Thank you very much for coming in today and doing this live event. And also thank you, the audience, and thank you, Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and also thank you, the Van Leer Institute, for your generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. My co-host, Dalia Shendlin, will be back with us pretty soon. But in the meantime, go to our website, follow us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter as well. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.